Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Leah Markey, the director of the Center for Renaissance Studies at the Newberry Library. It's lovely to see so many friends here in the audience. I'm excited to welcome you to the first conversation in the second year of this series devoted to race and dialogue, hosted by the Center for Renaissance Studies. The Newberry is an independent research library in Chicago with collections spanning more than 6 centuries of human history in Europe and the Americas. We've been free and open to the public since 1887. The Center for Renaissance Studies promotes the use of Newberry collections by undergraduates, graduate students, and scholars in the fields of late medieval, Renaissance, early modern studies, and colonial studies. Before I introduce you to today's program and to the series, I'll read the Newberry's land acknowledgement. As part of our commitment to addressing the ongoing legacies of dispossession and settler colonialism, as well as our relationships with the city, the land, and the environment, the Newberry Library has written the following land acknowledgement in partnership with the Chicago American Indian Center. Located near the confluence of several waterways, the Newberry Library sits on land that intersects with the Aboriginal homelands of several tribal nations, the Council of the Three Fires, the Potawatomi, Odawa, and Ojibwe nations, the Illinois Confederacy, the Peoria-Kaskaskia nations, and the Mea, Wea, Dakiwaki, and Meskwaki nations. The Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Kickapoo, and Mascoutin nations, also called the region of Northeast Illinois home. The Indigenous people continue to live in this area and celebrate their traditional teachings and lifeways. Today, Chicago is home to one of the largest urban Indigenous communities in the United States, and this land remains an important place for Indigenous peoples. As a Chicago institution, it is the Newberry's responsibility to acknowledge this historical context and build reciprocal relationships with the tribal nations on whose land we are situated. The Newberry is committed to diversity and inclusion. These conversations in our center will continue over the next years as we plan an exhibition devoted to race in the pre-modern world in conjunction with the Race Before Race conference at the University of Chicago in 2023. And we're here showing you that these conversations are available on YouTube through our center's YouTube page. Thanks go to Noemi and DI for helping us to organize this series. We're especially grateful to Noemi for acting as co-curator of our upcoming exhibition as well. The exhibition project involves an interdisciplinary group of scholars and graduate students throughout the US who are contributing to a related publication. And this group includes Heather Hughes, who is joining us today. And we're thrilled to have curators Heather Hughes and Stephanie Schrader with us today to discuss their work. They're both specialists in early modern Northern European art with overlapping interests in cross-cultural exchange, identity, and the representation of clothing from different parts of the world. Rather than provide a formal introduction for each of them, they will each briefly introduce themselves using some visual material along the way. This will provide the context for the conversation that will follow about lessons learned and experiences with exhibitions organized by Stephanie at the Getty. And I will get the information about these exhibitions in the chat, and Heather will also show you the catalog. Thank you both for being here today, Stephanie and Heather. I'll pass the mic over to Heather first.
Before Stephanie gives us a little bit of an introduction about her work, I just wanted to show off her work here. This book here is the exhibition catalog for Looking East, Rubens' Encounter with Asia, and Rembrandt and the Inspiration of India. And I think there'll be links in the chat here about those. So Stephanie will start us off.
Thank you. And I just want to say thank you to Heather for inviting me to be in this dialogue, and thank you to the Newberry team for making this such an important program and a platform for people to talk about these issues. And I can't wait to see your exhibition because I know how much effort goes into these. So I just wanted to say also thank you to the audience because I'm sick of Zoom, I'm sick of webinars, and I really appreciate that you want to spend time doing one more of these. So what you see on the screen are 2 drawings that are in the Getty's collection, where I'm curator of drawings. I look after the Northern Flemish, Dutch and Flemish drawings, and you see two drawings that have sort of been in my orbit for a long time. I was graduate intern at the Getty in 1993. And both of these drawings were in an exhibition that I did as a graduate intern about costume and drapery studies. And subsequently, I went off, did my dissertation on a Netherlandish artist who went to Italy and was very interested in cross-cultural exchange. I came back to the Getty in 2001, where I've been ever since, and have done exhibitions prior to these two that look at the ways that cultures come together and how artists look at other cultures, how they bring them into their artwork. And these two shows sort of culminated that intensive study that's happened for, oh gosh, 10 years now. So on the left, you see a drawing by Peter Paul Rubens, and it was featured in the exhibition that Heather spoke about, Looking East, Rubens' Encounter with Asia. It was a focused exhibition of about 20 objects that tried to really examine what Rubens could have known about Asia, particularly about Korea in the early 17th century. And on the right, you see a drawing by Rembrandt depicting Mughal imperial rulers, Shah Jahan and Dara Shikoh. And this was featured in an exhibition of about 62 works that paired Rembrandt's 20-some drawings of Mughal and Deccani rulers with compositions by Mughal and Deccani artists that allowed our viewers to look at the way Rubens was a pupil and learned from another culture, and how that study of another culture changed the way he drew.
So I'll take over. So I want to, first of all, thank everybody for joining us today. Again, continuing with Zoom, as Stephanie said. And I want to give a little context about why I invited Stephanie to speak with me today and why I was inspired by her work. I first encountered her research and her exhibition projects in 2013 with the Looking East project. At the time, I was researching a dissertation on the representation of global clothing customs in costume prints, travel accounts, and atlases. And I was in the early stages of researching and developing that topic. And at the time, as a sort of budding scholar, there was a tiny bit of insecurity that the study of clothing might be regarded as something frivolous. But projects like Stephanie, really showed that costume is a worthwhile subject of study, and that it was really operating in the early modern period as a lens through which Europeans were trying to understand and sometimes stereotype overseas cultures. Next slide, please, Rebecca. So now I currently work at the Davis Museum at Wellesley College. And we continue to be inspired by projects like Stephanie's, which help us think about how to present and teach our early modern collections within a global context, and to really emphasize these cross-cultural connections between different parts of our collection, different cultures. And so I thought it would be great to speak with her further today and think about exhibitions that really underscore how globally interconnected the early modern world was, and thinking about this upcoming Newberry exhibition, how these exhibitions can invite audiences to reconsider their assumptions about the early modern period and its relevance to diverse American audiences. So today we're going to talk about how these shows can be unique opportunities and also present interpretive challenges that, when you address cross-cultural encounters in the early modern period. So my first official question for Stephanie. So we're going to start with a little bit of a micro question before going to the macro. And so since both of these exhibitions began with specific objects in the Getty collection, you were inspired by something that was in the collection, and from there the topic developed. I thought we could start with something that really inspired you from the object. So looking at the next slide, please. The Rubens drawing, Man in a Korean Costume, did not have an explicit identity assigned to it by Rubens that you could discern when you looked at this, right? And so this the identification of the subject has shifted over the centuries, what culture he was believed to be from, was he a specific person? So could you tell us a little bit about the history of attributing the subject and what challenges surfaced there?
Right. So what you see in front of you was like my first attempt to try to really sort through this drawing. And again, the way I work, it's based on the objects in the collection that I oversee. So I don't have an idea and then come in and find the objects that fit. I have the objects, and from those objects, I interrogate the objects and try to figure out, the questions that are relevant. So the first question was, is this a portrait? Does this show a specific person? And because it was so incredibly naturalistically drawn and so sumptuous in showing the silk and the horsehair headdress that lets light, go through this incredibly delicate object, it was assumed in a way that it had to be a portrait. Like, how could Rubens have ever made up this type of costume? So the first question in my mind was, is this a portrait? And is this the way Rubens made a portrait? And I show you as an example, a portrait of his first wife, Isabella Brandt, to show you how Rubens made a portrait. He showed you the head, typically. The clothing was not as relevant for Rubens when he was making a portrait. So already I was, and if you look at the drawing, the Getty drawing, you can see how small the head is compared to the clothing. So already I was wondering, is this really a person that he could have seen, and it's a portrait of someone that he knew? So that was the first question, which I subsequently decided that I didn't think it was a portrait. So next slide. Instead, this drawing, and I show you just a detail of the head on the right, in my mind related more to costume books. And this is where Heather and I overlap so perfectly. What I saw focused was not so much a specific detailed rendering of facial features that look like a portrait, but they were more generic. There were more stereotypes of how people from Asian culture were perceived in Rubens's time. And I'm showing you a costume book that in fact we know he owned, and that he could have looked at to get ideas about what, for example, Chinese people wore in the early part of the 17th century. So moving this away from a specific person more to a generic type was where I saw this drawing fitting into. Can we have the next slide, please? And then the question became, well, what else did Rubens depict that looked anything remotely like the drawing in the Getty's collection? And it turns out Rubens made quite a few drawings of other people wearing Asian clothing. So the question became, how does this clothing compare to the clothing rendered by him in another drawing? And in the case of the drawing of the Metz collection that you see on the far left, we know that Rubens in 1617 had a commission from a Jesuit missionary who was active in China to make his portrait. And that part of that portrait, the painting, was to make preparatory drawings. And in those drawings, he made costume notes, specifically talking about what was worn, what kind of fabric the color was, what the length was. And you can't see this very well, but it's in the upper right-hand corner. So when Rubens made costume studies, they were very specific because he wanted to reference them later when he made his paintings, so they were accurate. And they also, when he made portraits, he often, in the case of here of Nicholas Turgot, he put their name and the date on the drawing. So we know that Rubens, when he wanted to be specific, and he often was, he was specific. When he had the information that he needed, he would write it down. So comparatively, when you look at the Getty drawing, which is about the same size on the same type of paper, you don't see the same level of rendering of the fabric that you see. The two are slightly different. And this is something that if we were in person, you could see this much more carefully. But the drawing on the left has much more of a feeling of reportage, that he's actually looking at someone and rendering it as a way to make a record of it, where the one on the right is more in the realm of fantasy. It's more in the realm of imaginary. It's more in the realm of stereotype becoming, animated and brought to life. And the way he does that is puts touches of red chalk on the lips and on the ears and on the cheeks, has the viewer gaze out at you directly, and you feel like you are in the presence of somebody that he could have seen. But when you start looking closely and interrogating this drawing further, you start realizing, like, is this a real person or is this a fantasy? And where you really find the fantasy part coming at play is if you look at the feet. There are no feet, right? This person doesn't stand up. This person doesn't actually have feet. And you can see, if you look at the detail in the upper right, that he's trying to figure out what this person wears underneath these voluptuous robes. Does he wear fabric that you see him showing on the far right, or is his leg bare? And he doesn't know. And that's where it all kind of unravels in this sumptuous, naturalistic, incredibly compelling and captivating drawing that makes you think you're looking at somebody. It all kind of falls apart at the feet. And also this narrative fantasy quality that is beefed up in this drawing comes with a depiction of the ship in the background. So some story is being told here. It's not just a costume study recording what someone wore for the posterity of a portrait. Next slide, please.
Stephanie, actually, I just want to jump in before you go on. I really appreciate that you brought in the printed material in the previous slide as a potential source of inspiration for this picture, because, while of course there were people from different parts of the world passing through Europe, and there were occasions for European artists to draw these people, it's really important, I think, for people to realize that print culture provided a lot of the source of inspiration and visual information for things that often appear as if they're done from life. And this is one of those situations where you might have had that influence of prints, which in this case were based on other drawings, potentially other prints. So you're really getting further and further removed from an original situation, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
So, and then lastly, just in terms of interrogating the drawing and trying to figure out where it fits, in Rubens' work, you end up with the figure in the drawing reappearing in a large monumental altarpiece. And I show you that on the right, and you can see in the background a figure in gold robes with a horsehair headdress depicted and this is in a Counter-Reformation image of depicting the miracles of St. Francis Xavier, and part of a much larger narrative about Jesuit missionaries, in this case in Goa, trying to help this Francis Xavier become a saint, be canonized. It's part of a much larger conversation about Catholicism. So what seemed isolated, and this is an image of just Rubens' fascination with foreign clothing, becomes part of a much larger narrative. And we know that this narrative was scripted insofar as the fact that we have the Modello by Rubens that I show you on the left. And when he was thinking through this composition and how to show miracles being performed in Goa and the conversion of local people to this Catholicism, and you see him really thinking this through. But the figure in the background originally wore a caftan and a turban. So this, like, how do you represent someone from a faraway place to a culture back in Antwerp where this painting was put on view? It is not an easy question even for Rubens or his patrons to figure out. And this drawing has a context, and that context was essential to trying to figure out what he's trying to do. So that's the background on Rubens. And one last slide that really just kind of blew everything out of the water in terms of this image is, in terms of the drawing, is a reproductive print made in 1774 that shows the Getty drawing in reverse and gives the drawing a narrative, gives the drawing a story. And the story is that he was a Siamese ambassador who was visiting England in 1636. So for 200 years, that's what the drawing was identified as. It was in a private collections. all over Europe, and that's where it stayed, and that's where, you know, the identity was considered done. And it was only in 1935 that people began to ask questions about this drawing and its identity. So the real issues for me are that, you know, these drawings are not documents, they are representations, and we have to figure out what is trying to be represented and what the function of the drawing is for.
And absolutely taking into account the artistic convention, general artistic convention of the period, as well as an individual artist's approach to studies and portraiture. In this case, Rubens, who's very effective at making studies appear to be more portrait-like than they may actually turn out to be. So my next question is thinking about this at this exhibition level and how you framed these topics for the public. And so, you know, from personal experience, I know that when you work on an early modern exhibition, that curators and the marketing team sometimes come up against the challenge of talking about a specific country or geographic region that doesn't map exactly or neatly onto modern state name conventions for today. So as Northerners, we encounter this a lot with things like whether it's Netherlandish or Dutch or Flemish, and, you know, do people know what we mean by those regions, and how does that relate to, you know, current day countries? And that, of course, comes into play with the Rembrandt exhibition, where you have the Mughal Empire and India sort of at play there. So I was wondering if you could talk about your experience trying to balance historical accuracy when discussing nationality and ethnicity in the early modern period, but at the same time also trying to connect with contemporary living audiences.
Yeah, and that is a difficult question. And I definitely struggled with that with this exhibition title. And, you know, we're told to come up with catchy titles that people will not even blink an eye about what the exhibition's about. So in an exhibition that was pairing Rembrandt drawings with Mughal paintings, it seemed clear that you could say Rembrandt and Mughal India, but no one knew what Mughal India was in my world, so that wasn't allowed. So the question then became, did I fight for a title that I thought would be more reflective of the exhibition and more true to the period, or did I just want to get people in the door and have them look at the art and read the text and hope that that the nuances that you're addressing in your question would be sorted out? And I found very quickly that those nuances that we worry about, sometimes the public cares about those issues and sometimes they don't. And you balance that. In the case of this exhibition, the public really cared about that title. And I should have maybe articulated that better to our communications team, because India, as you know, didn't exist until 1947. And the relationship between India and colonial history is very complicated and very fresh and very fraught. So to have India in the title, what became very apparent to many visitors, mostly more when I went to India and talked about the exhibition, was who's India? Not my India, because Rembrandt is depicting Mughal rulers who are Muslim. And that is not reflective of many Hindus that live in India today. So the title alone became sort of like the summary of everything that could go wrong with this exhibition. And, you know, in the end, it was, I would explain, you know, why we came up with the title, and it was fine. And various didn't make people not come to the exhibition, but the word India alone was definitely fraught.
And did you face that more locally, abroad in India, or where was that pushback happening most?
Mostly when I went to India, it was happening because I went on a lecture tour, which I think, actually it's not the next slide, but let's go to the next slide though, because I'll show you where else it came up. Heather, like you asked me about this, so sorry, we're gonna do it in this order.
Her fault, sorry.
Yeah, it came up as well when the captions in the book as well as in the labels. So for the Rembrandts, you know, we said Rembrandt, but often we didn't know the name of the artist who made the composition that we paired with the Rembrandt. Sometimes we did, I would include it. And I should say that I worked with a team of experts. I know not much about Mughal painting. I learned a lot, but I didn't do this by myself. I don't do any of these projects by myself. I'm not qualified to have conversations about Mughal paintings. So that when I work, I have a team of people that I bring together and we work collaboratively. I should have said that earlier, but I'm saying it now. So one of the things we did was, so much of the project was trying to find the pairs that match so well with the Rembrandt drawings. And we had another supplementary room of the exhibition that showed Mughal artists actually looking at Dutch prints before Rembrandt even knew what a Mughal painting looked like. So we tried to, when talking about the cross-cultural exchange, we wanted to give a sense that Rembrandt wasn't the first to do this. In fact, he came after Mughal artists who were already doing this, and that he was, his style of making prints was completely uninteresting to Mughal artists, right? So that was sort of reversing the assumption that Rembrandt was the superior artist. And basically the whole point of the exhibition was people came for Rembrandt, but they stayed for the Mughal artist, right? That's what excited people, because the Rembrandt drawings were so strange and so different than what he typically drew. But when you see them in relationship with the Mughal paintings, that's what you realize, like, wow, what did he learn? What did he take away from these? How did he carefully study this culture? And that was the whole debate. But what, in doing the whole project, not knowing the name of the Mughal artist, I said unknown Mughal artist, or unknown Indian artist, parentheses, Mughal. And that, again, was, I should have thought that through. I should have done what I've done now on the screen. I've corrected myself. I should have said unidentified Mughal artist as a way to make it specific, not to India, but to the Mughal culture. Mm-hmm. So I'm just giving you ways that this became very complicated very quickly. And in the efforts to do everything else for the exhibition, that was something we overlooked. I overlooked, and when I put it on view, I didn't realize it until after the fact. So the next slide, I think. Now remind me of the question again.
Oh, I was asking about the responses to the title, to using India, right. And how if the reaction was as strong locally as it was in India. Was there a distinction?
Right. So I think the reaction was stronger in India. So and at the Getty, we would have, different groups every day. So I'd have the Dutch consulate in the morning. I'd have the Pakistani Business Association in the afternoon. And then I'd have, the cultural club from Artesia in the, late afternoon. So it was a whole group that would come, and every single tour would have to get adjusted depending who the audience was, right? Mm-hmm. And I knew that. I figured that out, that I had to do that. Because I went to India before and spoke, on different venues. And, the lecture that I gave would last for an hour, but the question and answers would last for an hour and a half. And then the television cameras. And so you realize quickly, it's like, wow, I'm basically teaching Mughal painting to a Hindu Indian audience. And that was, I did not expect that. I thought I was there to talk about Rembrandt. And in the end, that's not what everyone wanted to talk about at all. So that flipped. Then the conversation flipped, the exhibition flipped, and it was a surprise. But by the third time, I'd figured it out. And you see here a picture of me speaking with professor of art and aesthetics at JNU University at New Delhi, Naman Ahuja, and he was the curator of India and the World exhibition that was in Mumbai. And then he also had a conversation with me at the Jaipur Literary Festival, and it was hundreds of people. So, what the audience for my exhibition at the Getty was nothing compared to actually talking about the exhibition in India.
Oh, wow. Okay. Very interesting. So you touched on this a little bit earlier, but I want to know if you could talk about the different types of collaboration that went into this project, especially because this is such a cross-cultural topic that you're reaching across areas of expertise. How did those different levels of collaboration with audience members, with different specialists help shape the projects?
Right. So I think we go to the next slide for that. So I'm going to switch now back to the Rubens project, Looking East, because that really was sort of came out of the Korean community, and it was a completely different type of engagement than the Rembrandt project. So to sort of set you up for that, I'm showing you two books that were written about the Getty drawing prior to the exhibition. One is by the one on the left is by a professor in Busan, and another is a novel, one of 3 novels about the Getty drawing. So the Getty drawing had a whole other life in Korea that was made aware to me by the Korean community always coming to the Getty and asking to see the drawing. So it became clear that what I thought was interesting about our drawing was not maybe necessarily what the Korean community thought was interesting about the drawing. And that, engagement with them coming to the study room, showing them the drawing, talking to them, having conversations, having them bring me these books, having them tell me that a musical has been written about our drawing in Korea, like that, all of a sudden I thought, wow, what this drawing means to me as an expert in Dutch and Flemish drawings is a whole other story in Korea. And that's how the exhibition began, with that engagement. And the next slide, please. And I should say that what the Korean community strongly believed, and probably still does, was that our drawing was a portrait of Antonio Correa, who is a former slave that was purchased by an Italian slave merchant and brought back to Italy. And we know that from a posthumously published travel account written by this Francesco Carletti, the slave trader. So that was the story when the Getty purchased the drawing by Rubens in 1983. A Korean newspaper put that view of the drawing out, and that's what the drawing was assumed to be a depiction of. So that was the story that the Korean community wanted to have told about their drawing. And as you know, I thought there was a different story about this drawing. So the show became a way to bring the narratives about this drawing together, from everything from the one that says he's Siamese, from the one that relates him to the Chinese Jesuits, from the one that connects him to the story of Antonio Correa. All those narratives were brought together so that the public could see that this drawing was not fixed in its identity, that it had over time changed, and that we had to, basically we didn't have a definitive answer, and that this was the evidence and the public was going to decide what they felt. And I could not control that, and I didn't try to control it. And the next slide, please. I show you here how important this drawing, you just really can't quite understand it. And I didn't understand it until I went to Korea, because we lent the drawing to a exhibition at the National Museum in Seoul, The Secret of the Chosun Portraits. And as I walked up to the museum, our drawing, a reproduction of our drawing, was hanging like 50,000 times larger than it is from the wall of this museum. And when I went to the exhibition, there was a whole animated film about our drawing, explaining who they thought the drawing was and what, it was not at all what I expected. And then subsequently, both the Korean president and the Korean prime minister came to the Getty to see the exhibition. So this exhibition didn't exist, just to me and the Getty. It existed to the entire Korean community, which is over 1 million people. And it was only made possible with the help of the Korean community bringing national treasures from Korea, with me collaborating with Jesse Park to help, navigate this tricky business of like getting loans from Korea, getting different views accepted, having the exhibition, text be translated in Korean, having Jesse give tours in Korean, having an article I wrote be translated into Korean. Like, that was the only way we were going to have a productive exchange. And it also depended on the only professor of Korean art in America at that time, Professor Berglund Youngman, who was at UCLA, working with her students, and having this, team effort to make the book possible and the exhibition possible.
Yeah, I love that. And I think some people think of these exhibitions as the singular vision of a curator, but really here, there's sort of origins coming from the public, coming from the audience, and then all of this collaborative effort from other scholars. It's just really, like I said, a team effort. But go ahead, you were gonna talk about something.
The next slide, I think, just shows you the way it was brought to life for the Korean public. First of all, I should say, in case you don't know, the Getty doesn't collect. In my department, we collect European art from the 15th century to the 20th century. We really end in 1908. We do not have non-Western art in my department. We don't have Korean paintings in the collection either. So it's not an encyclopedic collection by any means. So for the first time, we had Korean paintings, maps that showed, what Europeans knew about Korea, all those drawings that you saw illustrated before. Those were all represented in the exhibition to give people a greater sense of what people could have known about Korea. But what was really important to the Korean community was that we had a fashion show, because it was important to see historic dress on bodies moving in space with Korean music, trying to give a sense of the Chosun dynasty, and why, what this clothing looked like. It wasn't just like this static symbol that Rubens interpreted and misinterpreted, but it was, a living, breathing, event of culture that was performed for the Korean community who came, and as well as other, Getty visitors. So what you're seeing here is, on the left is a depiction of the head of the Korean Cultural Center, dressed up in a replica costume, and introducing the fashion show to the public. And then on the right, you see examples of the types of Korean clothing that were donned by high school students for this project. And I should tell you that the clothing was all designed by a famous costume designer who designs all the clothing for Korean soap operas.
Ooh.
Just to give a sense of how it was animated.
Yes, I love the sense that people were able to capture the material essence of the dress by having these real examples there, having a fashion show, and with this project and with Rembrandt, I'm sure you were bringing in audiences on the Rubens name, as well as the people who were coming for Rubens were not necessarily expecting to see so much about Korean art, especially knowing that this collection at the Getty is not encyclopedic, right? So this provided an opportunity for people who came for one thing to see something else and really expand their art historical boundaries. So we have to switch to Q&A for the audience in a moment, but I'm going to ask you just to speak a little bit about something that you're working on for the future. Can we see the next slide, please, Becky? So the Getty recently acquired a sketch by Rubens depicting a man of African descent. And I'm sure that this is raising a lot of the same questions that you faced with the Rubens drawing. Is this a portrait? Is this a type? Is this a tronia, as we'd say in sort of Dutch art historical studies? So could you give us a sneak peek into where you think you might go with this new acquisition?
Right. Well, this is a very recent acquisition insofar as it was blocked for export. It was coming from the UK, so it did not arrive at the Getty until 2018, where it was put on view almost instantly. And then, not long after that, because it's a work on paper, this is where it gets complicated. This is a work on ledger paper that has been fixed to a panel. So is it a painting? Is it a drawing? That is open to many conversations, but for now it lives in the drawings department and it is not put on view on a regular basis because there's so much, as you can see, I think down in the bottom of the figure, so much exposure of the paper. What you're seeing is actual, accounting notes on this piece of paper. And so it is not on view all the time. But immediately, once it went on view, it became part of a larger conversation about who is this person? Does it depict a person? Is it a portrait? Is it a costume? Is it a costume study? How does it relate to the story of the Adoration of Magi, which is what Balthazar was one of the, Magi that appears in a larger painting that Rubens depicted? How does it relate to his preparatory process? Who does this sitter, how does it relate to conversations about, were there Africans in Antwerp? Could he have seen one? Why did he portray him this way? Is this turban related to a turban by Tunisian kings? What is that relationship? Is it a fantasy or is it, part of a larger, naturalistic portrayal of a person, but then the person's dressed up? So those kind of conversations continue in this object, and it will be part of a long process to unravel, mostly because it technically trying to even just read what the paper, what is written on the paper has become a challenge. Trying to figure out the history of Africans in Antwerp, where Rubens even made this. Was it in Rome? Was it in Antwerp? Like, there's so many unanswered questions about this object, but for now, it is important starting point for a new project.
Absolutely. And I like the one particular avenue of research there that you touched on there, trying to understand the presence of Africans in Antwerp and how that might have played a role here. I think some of the people who were attending this session here are probably aware of the exhibition at the Rembrandt House last year, Black in Rembrandt's Time, that really involved a lot of archival research about the African community that lived within Amsterdam and how that informed some of Rembrandt's work or the work of other 17th century Dutch artists. Okay, I think we might be able to start taking questions from the audience. So I'm going to see what we have here. Okay, from Matthew Steinbrecher. When the drawing was lent to the exhibition, this is about the Rubens drawing. When the drawing was lent to the exhibition in Seoul, did you have any involvement with their exhibition or texts produced related to the drawing?
No, none. So there, that was completely independent.
And did they take a different approach there?
Yes.
Or
Yes.
Right, of course.
Yeah. I mean, it was to be Antonio Correa, but the main focus was to produce this animated video where, the drawing bowed and moved and had a whole story on a ship and the sea. So that was a surprise, but it was relevant to their questions in their community, and that was fine for me. Just as the way I presented it to Getty was relevant to my questions, in collaboration with the community, in collaboration with the other ideas, but trying to control a narrative when you're working collaboratively with a community that's invested in your drawing to be something that that's a tricky business. And in the end, it's more like being a diplomat, right? You've got to navigate and try not to insult anybody and be respectful and be mindful of the questions that are asked of your object are not those that you ask of the object. And trying to navigate how you tell the story of both, interpretations, of many interpretations. And in the end, we don't know. Like, I'm not going to claim that we have factual evidence to say that this drawing means this to Rubens. It's interpretation, and it's using historical evidence and art historical evidence and archival evidence the best we can, but there is no right answer.
There was a follow-up question related to loaning that. I think there's going to be more follow-up questions in relation to what you just said, but somebody wrote, I like this question and would love to hear more about the relationship to loaning institutions in general, especially since you explained that your department does not have non-Western art.
So for these exhibitions, we ask other institutions to borrow objects. And that is, that's where the collaboration is so key, because I don't have connections at the National Museum in Seoul, but Berglind Jungmann had connections at the National Museum in Seoul, and she had contacts there and helped get these meetings. So when we asked for the objects, it wasn't the Getty Museum just asking, it was the whole team asking. Mm-hmm. Similarly, for the Rembrandt, those objects mostly came from American, British, and European collections. Mm-hmm. So, and I went to every single one of those institutions and asked to study their object firsthand and to talk to a curator to see if we could borrow it. Because what happens typically is you get a letter from someone saying, can we borrow this object? They've never seen the object necessarily, but they know it's important to their story. So when you go the extra mile to show up, to look at it personally, to study it, to talk to the curator who's in charge of it, that means something. That matters. And in the case of, we pretty much, for the loans, we were pretty much successful in all the loans because of that work. In the case that we weren't was the Louvre, and they're difficult, and that was just part of the process.
I want to say, as a paper person, I always love to remind people that they can often request to see these items in study rooms. So the Rembrandt drawings after the Mughal miniatures, some of the Mughal works themselves. So, if you look in the back of this catalog, you can see all the different collections where you can find these in the United States and Europe, and see if you could see them in person if you weren't able to see the Getty show. Okay, so next question from Chris Fletcher. I'm very excited by the idea of letting the audience decide. Oh, sorry, I'll reread that. I'm very excited by the idea of letting the audience decide what to make of an exhibition. Could you talk a bit more about how you designed the Korean exhibition to promote that? Or to put it more broadly, what can museums and curators do to create the right conditions for allowing multiple audiences to do this?
Well, I mean, it's not so hard since our labels are so short that, you can't like write a book about it in an exhibition. So, and what I found from visitors, they often don't read the labels, right? So we think they're going to read the labels, and we spend a lot of time writing these labels, but often they just want to look. So, and you have to kind of realize that could happen, especially at a museum like the Getty Museum when we compete with Disneyland. So, we're not an academic institution in the same way, that the Davis is, or Harvard, or other institutions where these types of exhibitions have been done successfully. So the other thing is that for me personally, I don't tell super extensive, complicated stories. I try to make it as tight as I possibly can, because I think the more stories you try to tell in an exhibition, the more confused visitors can become, and the more take away their engagement with the object. I think they just burn out. I mean, I think art historians love to see 500 objects in an exhibition or 300 objects in an exhibition, but I think for often the general public, it's too much. So, to me, I tighten, and I offer, in the case of the Korea, many perspectives within that exhibition, and don't try to script it too much that they have to have the same interpretation.
Mm-hmm. We have another interpretation question from Eve Strassman-Flanzer. Hi, Eve. Former curator from the Davis at Wellesley. To what degree have you or will you work with interpretation and education teams to help facilitate these community connections and focus groups for this next Rubens project? Great question, Eve.
Yeah.
Or at the Getty, are curators responsible for engaging directly with community groups?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I don't have an exhibition on, the oil sketch planned. So it's not, it's a research project right now. So it's not necessarily an exhibition project. And in the past, it has been me, the curator, doing the community outreach, or the community coming to me, the curator, not through our education department. So what happens with that in the future is still undetermined. And, it depends on who's head of our education and how involved their team wants to be. Usually that's not how it works at the Getty. Usually it's the curator's project, and then the educators teach the show after the fact. But I don't know what that'll be like in the future.
Yeah, there's been a lot of great work done in museums working with different kinds of advisory panels, whether they're composed of people from the community, a mixture of community and different scholarly perspectives. So yeah, it's definitely produced a lot of really interesting connections with audiences for the past few years. So the next question is from Laurel Garber, Philadelphia Museum of Art. Dress and clothing appear to be so important in these drawings and to both of your approaches to research. Can you both speak a bit about your interest in costume and dress and its portrayal in graphic art?
Heather, I'm going to let you answer that question.
Sure. Yeah, so that's a big question for somebody who wrote all about costume for lots of pages. My interest in that, particularly in the early modern period, is looking at moments of cultural difference and recognition of that difference in the early modern period, particularly before the modern day notion of race comes into play. And that's not to say that there aren't types of racializations happening in the early modern period, especially as you have the transatlantic slave trade being developed. And of course, there are scholars in the working on the medieval period and even classical antiquity who are doing a lot of great work right now thinking about how racialization processes have happened historically. But for my interest, I was looking at, before people are applying the titles of white and black and things like that on figures from different countries, what are they looking at? How are they signaling difference? And costume seemed to be playing that role for a long period, especially as clothing was sort of like an external index or register of morality or character. And that seems to be especially salient when looking at European representations of Native Americans and what their use of certain materials to make clothing, or from the European perspective, lack of wearing clothing, even though of course they were wearing clothing of different types of materials, what that signaled about their level of civility or adherence to any kind of religion or religious practice. Stephanie, do you want to add anything?
I think that's great. And I'm so happy that you answered that question.
Okay, great. Thank you, Laurel. I will jump to the next question. Okay, Christina Straub. I admire the respect you give. This is for Stephanie. I admire the respect you give audiences in giving them control over the story that an exhibition can tell. But isn't it also important to tell stories that the audiences may not have thought about? How do you hit a balance between these two kinds of approaches?
All right. I think, the Rubens show did that. I mean, I presented my point of view. I presented other people's point of views. I don't think in that case, when you have 20 objects, you can be a little nimble because you're focusing on one, but you bring in others to tell how it can be interpreted. We had costume in this exhibition as well. We had paintings from Korea. We had maps. So we definitely let the audience sort of wander through the exhibition and make their decision. But I don't think this is uncommon, actually. I think in many exhibitions, it happens. And I can say I think the exhibition that really made me believe this view that we can't control how people take away from our art, as a curator, you are a little bit of a control freak a little bit. But I did an exhibition where I put drawings on view and I wrote haiku, and I let people, read the haiku and then look at the objects and go back and forth. And then I asked the public to write haiku in response. And I had drawings set up on an easel, and I asked specific questions about what I wanted the haiku to be about. People wrote whatever haiku they wanted to. Like they didn't follow the instructions. That wasn't what inspired them. They were inspired to be asked for their opinion. They were inspired to write about art in the gallery, but it wasn't necessarily what I thought they should write about. They wanted to write what they wanted to write about. And that's when I really realized, like, we can't control anything. like we think we can, but we can't. And it's important to give into that.
Mm-hmm. But what's great is that you allowed space to invite people to participate. So by asking for the haiku, and they took you up on that offer. Okay, so we have one more question that we can take before we close out, from Sophia too. Thank you both for the super enlightening discussion. Thank you, Sophia, especially concerning the developmental process of building these exhibitions. Stephanie mentioned corrections and discoveries that she made once the exhibitions opened for the public. For both the Rubens and the Rembrandt exhibitions, were you able to reflect these discoveries in the exhibition catalogs after the fact?
No. I mean, if I had, you could, what you typically will see inserted into catalogs, like, corrections, and they'll say, this is wrong or this is wrong. In the case, I wasn't going to write a whole narrative about like the title, how am I supposed to do that? Right. And how am I supposed to do that and not offend our, communications team? There's no way to do that. I think in an exhibition, I just think it's important to be humble, and it's important to know that you're going to make a mistake. And when you're trying to do something different and collaborative that isn't your area of expertise, that you're not going to always get it right. And hopefully, the public is actually the most forgiving. It's the scholars who are the least forgiving. So you just, I think it's the humility that's the most important to make these projects go forward successfully.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie.
I think that's a beautiful way to conclude this conversation and think about humility and being open-minded and creating these exhibitions. So I want to thank Heather and Stephanie for this wonderful conversation. We've all learned a ton, and just want to remind everyone that we recorded this and we will get it on our YouTube in the next couple of days, and you can see other programs that we've done on YouTube, including the other talks and conversations in this series, the Race and Dialogue series. And I also wanted to put in a plug for our next Race and Dialogue conversation, which is March 25th with Ayanna Thompson and Noemi NDI. And they're going to be talking a bit about the Race Before Race Collaborative and other issues surrounding that in their own work. And so we're looking forward to that. And just thanks again to Heather and Stephanie. This is wonderful. And we look forward to talking more with you and consulting on our own show too. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Leah.
Thanks for being here, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.